Kia ora, it's Louise Ward here, and I'm the host of this episode of Made in New Zealand, where we talk to Kiwi musicians, artists and writers. And today we welcome Chris Maclean, author of many books, including the recently published Anxious Autumn. So let's begin. Chris, welcome. Welcome to Radio Kidnappers.
Hi, Lou.
But tell us a little bit about your writing background and the books you've already had published.
Well, I've been writing and publishing books since the late 1980s, and I started off doing a series of landscape histories, really writing about what I saw out the window. I wrote a book about the Tararua Ranges in Wellington, and then moved on to Kapiti Island, that famous conservation arc off the coast of the lower North Island. And then moved on to sort of doing national biographies and sort of books on more specialist subjects that had a national audience. But this book, Anxious Autumn, emerged out of inadvertently spending lockdown in Napier City, and it was a delightful place to be caught for 5 weeks, I'd have to say. I couldn't think of anywhere better. I was staying with my partner at the time, and so when we knew what was coming up, and I think we got 2 or 3 days warning, didn't we?
Yeah.
We had to make that decision that a lot of people had to make, where am I going to be, who am I going to spend it with, and I was very happy to be here on Bluff Hill for that 5-week period, and it gave rise to Anxious Autumn, which was a book that was as inadvertent as my staying here for the lockdown.
Yeah.
It just sort of popped out.
So my impression from reading the book was that you and Robin, it's a fairly new relationship?
Yes,
Yeah.
18 months, yeah.
How was that then? You had to make that decision quite quickly about where you were going to be.
Yeah, and look, Lou, we'd only spent 10 days together on holiday, which is, it's kind of less than perfect preparation for the long haul of the lockdown. And I think the thing that, it's worth remembering about the lockdown is when we went into it, we didn't actually know how long it was going to be. Not only was it a very unusual and new experience for us, but it was open-ended. So, yeah, we had the conversation, do we spend it together, which was, in the innocence of the situation, was easy to make. And then we had to decide where, and that wasn't difficult. I mean, I felt that, being in Napier would be good. Robin would be in her patch, and at that stage I didn't even really fully understand the implications of what lockdown meant in terms of personal relationships. I mean, I don't think we'd ever had a time when people couldn't sort of congregate or communicate with each other, and so she's a very gregarious sort of person, loves people, needs them, helping them is what is her raison d'etre, really. So I felt it was important to be in her area. I lived down on the Kapiti coast in quite an isolated place full of elderly people, and it's kind of quiet, and anyway, it was the right call to make, but we're now at the moment, of course, with the changed situation that's just occurred over the last sort of 48 hours, having the conversation again. Yeah.
So, and what's the conclusion of that then?
Well, I think
how did it go the first time round?
I think this time it'll be on the Kapiti coast, actually. Yeah, well, I do a lot of conservation work down there, and I've got hundreds of plants just sitting there waiting to be planted out on the dunes, and if they don't go in over the next week or two, they'll be, pot bound with the roots. So that's one selfish consideration, and another one is that I'm busy working on a new book which has got a lot of historical material for it. And so, I'd ideally like to be close to that material. But I was very mindful of the fact that, again, I needed to think about her, not just myself. So we talked about it yesterday, and that's what we concluded.
Cool. So it seems fair's fair. So you are a historian. You're a chronicler of other people's lives.
Indeed.
So how was that sort of going from research and people perhaps long gone, or to writing about the immediate, the now, and it being quite personal?
Well, yeah, interesting question, Lou. I mean, the personal, I had embraced it in an earlier book which came out 2 years ago, which was a memoir, and so that was my first sort of voyage into being rather more revelatory, and Yeah, it was quite an uncomfortable experience, I have to say, with both books, in the sense that the technique that I adopted was to do a hard-out first version where you don't write with any fear or favour to anyone, and then you send it to anyone and everyone who's mentioned and get them to respond. And as with the memoir, I found with the COVID diary that people mentioned, sometimes were, like my ex-partner, had some quite specific requests to make about what the stuff not to be included. And equally, other people who were mentioned were very enthusiastic. And in fact, I'd only really started doing this for something to do because my number one book had been sort of temporarily put into abeyance because I was having a slight issue with my clients about how much, ironically, personal material to include. So I started the COVID-19 diary as just something to do during lockdown, did that for a week, and then I resolved the issue with my clients on the other book, and so I could have at that stage just given it away. But by that stage, friends had been really encouraging about this, and so although it was personal, although it was kind of new to me, I thought, well, I'll carry on and see how it goes. And in fact, I did both books side by side, sitting in the gutter across the road from Robin's place. Although it was, beautiful autumn here in Hawke's Bay, just glorious, really. And I think that had a lot to do with the success of the lockdown. Her place is tucked in under a hill in Shakespeare Road. Doesn't get much sun at this time of year, so I'd go across the road, sit in the gutter and write my two books there. And I got 25,000 words of the COVID diary done and another 17,000 of the other one. So I was busy. As for the personal thing, I started to get used to it, actually, once I sort of realised that it's not the end of the world. I mean, really, the struggle actually is indifference. The struggle is to get people interested in reading something, really, I think, these days, especially when, as you know, the book is in retreat in the face of such a wide range of competing mediums.
Oh, yeah. The book industry is a bit of a crazy place to be. But this is not going to sound initially complimentary, but I was surprised by how I was completely pulled in by the book. Because we'd all lived the lockdown in our different ways, and we all thought we'd lived it the same to a certain extent, but reading your diary, we kind of hadn't, and it's quite comforting to read somebody else's experience and find the similarities and the differences. But you mentioned sitting in the gutter, and there's a fabulous photo of you in there, randomly sitting in the gutter so that's Shakespeare Road, is it?
Yeah.
So tell us about that.
Well,
your experiences in the gutter.
Musings from the gutter, or utterings from the gutter.
I like that one.
Yeah. Well, just going back to your earlier point, I mean, I think the thing is, if I can get people to engage with the book, then they do come away with exactly what you have just said. That the thing about the lockdown was that although it was a universal phenomena, it was actually always and necessarily a subjective experience because essentially everybody's domestic circumstances are different. So I was very aware that I shouldn't just write an account of my and Robin's experience. So I tried to sort of democratise it by pulling in various other people's experiences through things like, a couple of guest writers, also 2 interviews, also charting the experiences of 2 other couples in different parts of the country, and a friend of mine, my designer Jeff, who was doing it on his own in Wellington, and melding all that in with the sort of local and international sort of political scenes, which are also fascinating. So I'm hoping that sort of approach does provide a greater sense of commonality for the reader. But as to the thing about the gutter, it was interesting because I was just doing it out of a sort of atavistic search for sunshine and warmth. But it was only possible because of the lockdown. Like normally Shakespeare Road is characterised by 2 things: cars parked up and down either side all day, and secondly by people using it as a conduit from one side of the hill to the other. So there's traffic roaring past the whole time, and there's little stone chips flying up, and it's noisy, and it's car dominated. But as we know, during the lockdown, the car was in abeyance. I mean, it was one of the most fantastic aspects of it, I think. And particularly up on Bluff Hill, where, you've got this labyrinth of little narrow streets, suddenly it was a pedestrian dominated environment, and it was quiet, and you could wander around those streets. So the streets were reclaimed by people, and part of that was sort of writing in the gutter, which suddenly sort of seemed more normal, really. And, I think if it was today, A, it wouldn't be possible, and B, it'd just kind of be...
Someone would call the police, actually.
Yeah, no.
There's this man sitting in the gutter.
Yeah. Whereas, and also the thing was that people were much more outgoing. Like, we're all in this together. We sort of realise, I know the team of 5 million is a convenient cliche, but it was actually true. We realised that our survival depends on our sort of willingness to work together as a group of people living in this little isolated island. So there was a greater sense of sort of friendliness, and also at the same time, of course, people are out doing their constitutional walk every day, and so this road that's normally like a river of traffic was actually a river of people. And they're walking up and down. Of course, they got to do their social distancing, but seeing a guy sitting and tapping away on his laptop in the gutter is a cause for comment, which invariably it was. And it was usually, fortunately, kind of rhetorical, but sometimes, one time a guy stopped me, and, he just driving along and stopped his car, and he would have talked to me through the window for about 5 minutes. He could do that because, of course, he was virtually the only car on the road for half an hour. And there were other little incidents, like the cat just about getting killed in a car, sort of braking heavily to avoid that. But generally it was just like if you were in the Philippines or Indonesia or somewhere like that, where people live on the street and they make things and they do all kinds of things out on the street, and that includes writing.
And isn't it strange that we're all locked down, so we were supposed to be isolated, but we made more random connections with people than we will now? It's quite a sort of strange thing to be going through, isn't it?
Well, do you think that, that's an interesting point, because did that greater sense of social interaction, do you feel that actually stopped as soon as the lockdown stopped?
Probably not as soon as it stopped, but I do feel that we've... this was one of my questions for later, actually, so we might as well bring it up now, is the things that, we swore to ourselves that, right, we've found a better way, we'll take gains from this, we'll take learnings from this. And I do wonder if we have just gone straight back to it, because I know my life got busy. As soon as people could do things, my phone was ringing and my emails were pinging, and, let's do this and this and this and this, and it's all gone a bit mad again. So what are the learnings that you personally have made?
Well, I think it's an interesting question, because like you, I noticed with the traffic that the return to the past was immediate. As soon as I think we came off, first of all 4 and then 3, and at both points, the way the traffic reasserted itself was really disappointing, and yet, it was naive, I guess, to think any other way.
Yeah. But
I would like to think that sort of greater sense of neighbourhood engagement might possibly have continued. Yeah, sure, it might have been diminished a little bit, but I'm sort of hopeful that perhaps that sense that we're all in this together, and we have a sort of greater sense of the need for kindness has continued. I'd love to think that, and I sort of, maybe that's just my optimism colouring what I see in the population, but now it's happening again, and that's what I'm interested to see, is how is this tested. Like, I was in Waipukurau yesterday afternoon in a shop, and they just reinstituted social distancing, so it was one out, one in, cones at the door with a entry queue and an exit line, and I was just waiting there at the door for somebody to come out so I could go, and a guy came up behind me and he said, expletive, they started that expletive again, what the... etc. Yeah. And he was angry, really angry, and I thought, well, okay, this is interesting, because the first time round people were, even though they sort of had to learn how to do social distancing, they were prepared to try. This time, from that man's reaction, I thought, okay, there's not necessarily going to be the same willingness to engage a second time.
It is a worry, actually. Yeah,
I reckon.
Yeah. From a bookseller's point of view, where we found in the shop yesterday that it was quite an emotional day.
Right.
People, we had. My first customer was quite sort of in denial and angry. You could feel that coming off him. The second saw me in a face mask and went, "What's going on?" And I don't know how he'd missed the news because everybody's phone screamed at them twice.
Right.
Yeah, but throughout the day it was sort of, people coming in going, "Oh, is it happening again? I need to get books for the children." Or So I think we're thrust into that uncertainty again, aren't we? So we may be heading for an anxious spring. So you may have to do book 2. Yeah. So the characters in the book, because I think that's what really drew me in, is that you spoke so lovingly and eloquently about your partner and your friends, and they became real to me, even though I'd not met them, or I think I've met Robin very briefly. And so how did they feel about being in it? I know you've said you've had to take some things out, but how did they react to it?
Well, by and large, people seem to be quite happy, actually. If anybody kind of contacted me, and it was kind of interesting how, with my experience of lockdown was that, friends and family got in touch just to find out how you are, but also I got a few people who I would call peripheral in my life who suddenly, for some reason, sort of contacted me, which I thought was kind of strange, really. It was like, everyone thought that, maybe they think we're all going to die or something. It's the kind of sort of thing you do, on the deck of a, drowning ship. But anyway, to all of these people, in response to their inquiry as to how I was doing, I sent them, what I'd written so far as a way of answering their question. And most of them came back and were very enthusiastic. And apart from my ex-partner, who, had quite good practical reasons for what she requested removed, most people were quite comfortable with their depiction, and I made it clear that they were entirely entitled to make changes, but everyone seemed to be pretty happy about it. But then, of course, there was no intention to publish. So this was just a diversion, Lou. And so, I suppose one or two of them might have thought of, okay, he's got a track record of publishing everything he writes, so watch out. Yeah. But for most of them, I think they just thought it was a kind of, that's just what Chris is doing during lockdown, and they didn't. It was only when the MTG, our local regional museum and theatre and gallery in Napier, had a call, I think it was way towards the end, maybe early April, they said, look, anyone out there who's recording their experience of lockdown, we want to know about it. We want to archive this for the future. So, researchers and historians can see what it was like here in the Bay for people under these circumstances. It was only then that I really considered publishing it, and even then I was sort of thinking, okay, well, I'll do 50 copies and just put it into the institutions and legal deposit at the National Library and so on. But that was based on the assumption that the unit cost of a book would be very high, so we might be looking at $40 a copy. But what I actually found was that in publishing this book, I learned about printing in New Zealand, which was fantastic, because in the past I've always worked through China, and you just send off your specs to the Chinese, who are ever obliging and will produce whatever book you want at an incredibly reasonable price. Well, it's not really feasible to do that anymore. You've obviously got problems about sort of shipping and everything else, and the time it takes, and also the number of books I was printing here was pretty low. But by learning how to change the specifications, the paper size, the size of the book itself, how much colour, to have, I was able to get the unit price down to the point where I could have considered, doing 500 copies. So it was like everything to do with this book. It was kind of inadvertent and accidental.
Excuse me, I thought I was going to sneeze, and that's really not cool at the moment. Oh, panic. So we've got a few minutes left. What's coming next then? You mentioned your new book. Are you able to tell us anything?
Oh, yeah. And it's quite a Hawke's Bay book, except that it's really set back in the it starts off in the 1860s on Patani Beach in Napier with a shipwreck there of the Royal Bride and 13-year-old boy on board on his first trip. I mean, incredible to think of a 13-year-old kid, coming all the way around the world from England in the company of, sort of grown men. I mean, it sort of mind boggles, really.
Yes, yeah.
but his name's Robert Batley, and he was cast up on the beach there. In fact, it was fantastic. The only reason the crew survived was that the local Maori formed a human chain out to the stricken vessel and got everyone ashore that way, which is just, really gutsy stuff. Because you know what the waves are like on that shore. It's steep, it's gravelly, and it's just where the waves meet the shore. It's just a sort of vortex of stones and spume, really.
Oh, it takes you, It
does, yeah, it definitely does take you. And anyway, he survived, and the local grandee, Donald Maclean, who had just retired from national politics and his number one occupation of separating Maori people from their land, which he did with incredible success, unfortunately. Anyway, he'd set up a farm out at Maraikakaho, and he employed a young Robert Batley for several years on his property there, and I think he did that so that his son, who was just a year or two younger, would have a friend, because of course Donald was really resident in Napier, running Napier at that stage. Anyway, Robert learned how to manage sheep there, and then he went inland to Kuripapango. I think he was probably intent on looking for gold, of which there were quite a few people doing that in the 1860s in the hills of Hawke's Bay, but there was also Te Kooti, who had come down and was sort of marauding around the central North Island, and it was actually Renata Kauapo from here, from out at Omahu, who was leading the colonial troops against, the colonial effort against Te Kooti. And so Robert stayed at Kuripapango, and then from there he helped the Birches, who were the first to run sheep in inland Patea, get them across the Naroro River and up into the hill country beyond. There's a great plateau that really lies just beyond the break in the Kawekas and the Ruahinis, and it extends sort of south to Taihape and right across to the Desert Road, and that area was then known as Inland Patea, and no one's ever really written a history of it. And the person whose biography I'm writing, Tony Batley, who's the grandson of Robert, Tony tried in the sort of he started in the 1950s, and he really tried right through until the 1970s. And he didn't succeed in doing a history of Inland Patea because, paradoxically, he knew too much.
Oh,
he just had an iron in every academic fire. And so, one of the virtues of my limited knowledge of any subject is it makes it paradoxically a lot more easy to write a book about it, because you just sort of draw all the research material onto your workbench and you sort of assemble it in front, and then you sort of get it to the point in your mind where you can write about it. And once you've sort of written about it, you just sort of clean the workbench, so you wipe it out of your mind again, and then you bring the next lot on for the next chapter. So my mind is relatively uncluttered through a state of ignorance, but it's actually really helpful. Whereas Tony, his workbench, his mind was just chocker.
Too emotionally invested as well, I would imagine.
Yeah. So, he tried and he tried and he tried, but because he wanted to put everything in, he couldn't really handle the structural challenges of writing, which is, of course, it's so important what you leave out. You can't put everything into a book. You've got to tell a story, and each chapter has to tell a story, and so the narrative has got to be predominant. Detail is only detail, and it should only support what you're trying to say. And of course, poor old Tony was trying to put it all in, because that's what a conscientious person who knows everything
wants. A chronicler.
Yeah, exactly. So the book will really be a history of Inland Patea, seen through the three generations of one family, but with a greater resonance that will provide a history of Hawke's Bay, a history of Inland Patea, and all of that area to the east of the Desert Road, which is kind of a lot of it's army land for a start, but it's largely unknown. I guess the thing that people know most about it is the Kaimanawa wild horses, and it was Tony's idea to save the wild horses in the 1970s that started this whole thing. And he had a block of land that his grandfather had got through his association with local Maori in the late 19th century, which is right on the southern end of the Kaimanawa Ranges, and it's sort of adjacent to the army exercise area. And by the 1970s, there was only about 100 of the wild horses left there, and Tony was sort of worried that the herd was going to die out. So he set to work, raising the profile of the wild horses, and what he didn't know was actually the reason why the wild horses were diminishing was that the army, or a number of people in the army, were actually illegally sort of harvesting them for their own personal gain. So there was one major in the army who put 3 children through boarding school on horse meat. Yeah.
We might have to do another programme about this particular book. But just no, that's fine. It's fascinating. I wish we had a bit more time today. But just to wrap up, we hope that we're going to have the launch on Monday, but we'll have to wait and see how the levels work. So that's Monday. What's the date on the 17th, isn't it?
Yes, Monday the 17th of August, 6 p.m. at Waldini's Books in Hastings Street in Napier.
That's the one.
We've got an announcement coming up on Friday.
Yeah.
And I think that one of the things that I remember about lockdown was that there was very good communication from the government about what was going to happen next. And I thought that it was a masterclass in collective communication. If you want people to do things, you've got to give them time to adjust them, and you've also got to give them a bit of warning that there's going to be a singular announcement coming up. And that's what happened, and that's what's happening again now.
So we shall see.
We've got an announcement Friday, so yes.
Fingers crossed for Monday, but if not, we'll postpone and we'll do it another time. So, Chris, thank you so much. I really do think we'll do another show about the next book. But in the meantime, you've been listening to Made in New Zealand on Radio Kidnappers, the voice of Hawke's Bay.